He pretended he couldn't read. She wrote him every secret she had, and when he finally confessed the truth, she didn't run. What she did next broke him completely. If you've ever trusted someone with your most private thoughts and later discovered they knew far more than they ever let on, this story will stay with you long after it ends. Stay with us until the very last word. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Silas Rowan's fence line came down in the north pasture and his best draft horse threw a shoe in 3 inches of frozen mud. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking at both problems. The envelope in his left hand, the listing fence post visible through the gap in the tree line, the horse standing lopsided somewhere behind the barn, and he made the same decision he made about most things in his life. He dealt with what he could see first and saved the rest for after dark. The envelope sat on the table while he worked. It sat there while he pulled the shoe, while he reset the post with a sledgehammer handle cracked at the grip, while he ate cold venison and the last of a loaf that had gone harder than it should. It wasn't the only letter on the table. There were 3 others, 2 from the land office in Carthen, 1 from a man named Pruitt who kept trying to buy his southern acreage. But the one from the Rocky Mountain Frontier Marriage Bureau had a different weight to it, even sitting still. It took up more space than it deserved. He opened it last. Dear Mr. Rowan, we have received your application as forwarded by the Carthen County Clerk's Office and wish to inform you that the Bureau is prepared to assist in matching you with a suitable companion for frontier life. Per the notation attached to your file, we understand that reading and writing present a particular difficulty, and we have accordingly prioritized candidates who possess strong literacy skills suitable for managing correspondence and legal matters on your behalf. We have enclosed a selection of letters from candidates who have expressed interest in your situation. We ask only that you, or a trusted person on your behalf, review them and indicate your preference within 30 days. Silas set the letter down. He read it again from the top. Then he sat with it for a long moment in the particular silence that only exists in mountain cabins after sundown, when the wind drops and the fire is the loudest thing in the room. He was not illiterate. He had never claimed to be illiterate. He had filled out the county clerk's form himself, in his own handwriting, and had answered every question with the same economy he applied to all things. He had written N.A. in the box asking for the name of a person who could assist with his correspondence because he did not have one and did not feel the lack. Somewhere between his desk and the Bureau's files, that N/A had been transcribed, misread, or simply assumed to mean something that it didn't. He should have written back immediately to correct it. He knew that. He even reached for the inkwell. Instead, he picked up the smaller bundle of envelopes the Bureau had enclosed and held them without opening them for the better part of 10 minutes. Then he opened the first one, then the second, then the third. They were not bad letters. 2 of them were practical and clear. One mentioned that she had experience managing a household and wasn't afraid of hard weather. Another spoke at length about her Christian faith and her belief that a good wife's first purpose was the service of her husband's needs, which was both earnest and slightly exhausting to read. The third woman described herself as adventurous and wrote with a looseness that made him suspect the adventure she imagined for herself didn't much resemble the reality of Blackridge in February. The 4th envelope was different. It was thinner than the others. The paper inside was plain, not the cream stationery the other women had used, not the folded pages that smelled faintly of something floral. Just 2 sheets of ordinary paper, written on both sides in small, even handwriting that didn't waste space. Dear Mr. Rowan, I'll be honest with you, which I understand isn't always the quality a man looks for first in a potential wife, but I've found that honesty tends to save considerable time. My name is Eleanor Hart. I am 23 years old. I teach at the Milburn Township Schoolhouse in Pennsylvania, where I have been employed for the past 2 years. I am not beautiful in the way that word usually means, but I have been told I have a sensible face, which I take as a reasonable compliment. I am in good health. I can cook adequately, sew decently, and manage accounts well. I have strong opinions about the proper way to preserve vegetables and almost no opinions at all about fashion. I will tell you plainly why I am writing to a Frontier Marriage Bureau instead of accepting one of several offers I have received here. The men who have proposed to me are not unkind, but they want a particular kind of wife. They want someone who will agree with them gracefully and manage their home quietly and not press them on things. I am not good at that. I have tried. I find that I cannot say things I do not believe simply to avoid discomfort, and I cannot pretend to be smaller than I am simply to make someone else feel larger. I understand that you require assistance with correspondence and written matters, and I want to be honest about that as well. I have no objection to serving in that capacity. I am a teacher. Reading and writing are not burdens to me. They are the way I think. If you need letters written, documents managed, or legal matters put in order, I am capable of doing those things well. What I ask in return is equally simple: that you don't lie to me. I don't need poetry or grand gestures. I don't need a man who pretends the frontier is something it isn't. I need someone who will tell me the truth about what our life actually looks like so that I can decide whether I am suited for it. I suspect you are a practical man. I am a practical woman. Perhaps that's enough to begin with. Respectfully, Eleanor Hart. Silas read the letter 3 times. He set it down, picked it up, and read it a 4th time. He sat with it until the fire burned low enough that he needed to add wood. And when he got up to do that, he brought the letter with him and read it one more time by the light of the freshened flame. Then he sat down at the table with a blank piece of paper and a pen that needed trimming, and he thought about the right thing to do. The right thing was clear. He should write back to the bureau, correct the error about his literacy, explain that the whole arrangement had begun under a false premise, and close the matter. He held the pen over the paper. He thought about the line, "I need someone who will tell me the truth about what our life actually looks like." He thought about that for a long time. Then he dipped the pen and wrote a reply. Not to the bureau, but directly to Eleanor Hart of Millburn Township, Pennsylvania. And he said that he had read her letter with interest, that he found her honesty refreshing, and that if she was genuinely prepared for the realities of Blackridge territory, he would be glad to receive her in the spring. He did not correct the misunderstanding about his literacy. He told himself he would do it later, in a second letter. He didn't write a second letter. Spring came slow to Blackridge the way it always did. Not in a rush, but in arguments. One warm day followed by 3 days of driving sleet, patches of mud and ice existing simultaneously in the same field. Silas used those months the way he always used the months before a significant thing happened. He worked. He reinforced the east wall of the barn where the winter had pulled at the chinked logs. He patched the cabin roof, 2 shingles at a time, descending from the ladder each time the wind picked up, because the wind on that ridge had no particular regard for a man's schedule. He repaired the stone foundation around the root cellar entrance and replaced 3 sections of fencing along the creek line. He did not think much about Eleanor Hart, or rather, he did not allow himself to think much about her. When her face tried to materialize in his mind, which it did occasionally at odd moments, he pushed the thought aside the way he pushed most intrusive things aside, with work and with silence. He didn't know what she looked like. He had only the letter. The face he almost imagined was assembled from words. Sensible, she had said. And he found he could not build a picture from that. What he could not push aside was the specific problem he had created for himself. There were nights, lying awake in the cabin with the wind working at the gaps under the door, when he traced the shape of his own mistake with the particular clarity that comes only in the dark. He had let a wrong assumption go uncorrected. That was the beginning of it. And then he had written a letter knowing the assumption existed, which made him complicit in it. And Eleanor Hart was coming across most of the country under the impression that she was coming to teach a man to read, to be useful to him in that specific, concrete way. And when she arrived, she would discover that her entire premise was false. He should tell her before she left Pennsylvania. He should write the letter. He wrote it 3 times, in drafts, and burned all 3 of them in the fire because none of them sounded like anything but excuses. And Eleanor Hart had specifically said she did not want a man who would do something dishonest and then reach for reasons afterward. The 3rd draft he burned in March. By April, it was too late to send Apos anything that would reach her in time, and he told himself that was out of his hands now. And it almost worked. The stage from Carthen came on a Thursday. Silas was at the general store in Ridgeline when it came in, which was not something he planned. He had ridden down for a replacement draw pin for the plow harness, and the timing was accidental. He stood on the porch of the store and watched the stage pull up, and he watched the door open, and he watched 4 people climb out with varying degrees of difficulty. The first was an older man in a good coat who had the practiced descent of someone who took stages regularly. The second was a young couple who helped each other down with the particular physical collaboration of newlyweds who hadn't quite settled into each other's rhythms. The third was a woman. She was not what he had been braced for, which was his own fault for having been braced for anything at all. She was medium height, brown hair, pinned up in the practical way of someone who had been traveling for several days and hadn't bothered to arrange it more carefully before disembarking. She wore a gray wool coat that had been good once and was still decent. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and had a small trunk being unloaded from the boot by the driver, which she watched carefully as if she didn't quite trust the driver with it. Her face was, he thought about the word she had used, sensible. That wasn't quite right, or rather it wasn't the whole of it. She had dark eyes that moved quickly, taking in the street, the buildings, the mountain line to the north, back to the trunk, back to the street. She was already assessing. He recognized that instinct because he had it himself. She looked up and found him looking at her and didn't look away. "Mr. Rowan," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Miss Hart." A pause. He came down off the porch and crossed the street. Up close, she was slightly shorter than he'd registered. There was a small cut on her right hand, recent, from something sharp, and her boots had been resoled at least once. She looked at him with the same directness her letter had suggested, and he found it oddly comfortable. The way stepping into a room and finding the furniture where you expected it to be is comfortable. "You're bigger than I thought," she said. "You're younger," he said. That wasn't diplomatic. He hadn't meant it unkindly. She had said she was 23, and he'd known that, and still, standing in front of her, 23 felt like a very young number. But she didn't seem offended. She seemed to be having a similar recalibration of her own. "The bureau said you'd have a wagon," she said. "It's behind the store." "My trunk is heavy." "I noticed." He picked up the trunk. It was in fact genuinely heavy. He registered that with a flicker of curiosity, since she hadn't struck him as someone who brought unnecessary things, which meant the weight was either books or equipment, and either told him something. He loaded it into the wagon bed without comment, and she climbed up to the seat with a small grunt of effort that she didn't try to hide, and they sat for a moment in the particular awkwardness of two strangers who have agreed to share a life but have not yet spoken a sentence about anything that actually matters. "How long to your homestead?" she asked. 2 hours in good weather." She looked at the sky. The sky was doing something ambiguous over the northern ridge. "And in whatever weather that is?" 2.5. She nodded and said nothing else, and he clicked to the horse and they started north out of Ridgeline, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who had decided to wait until they had something worth saying. After about 20 minutes, when the town had dropped out of sight and the road was climbing through pine and the air had gotten the particular smell of high elevation that no other place has, she said, "Your letter was brief." "I don't write long letters." A pause. "No," she said, "you don't." He caught something in that, a slight weight, a recognition, but she was looking at the tree line and he couldn't read her expression. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "Not particularly," she said. "I wrote enough for both of us." The cabin was worse than she'd expected, and she didn't try to hide it, which he appreciated. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the main room, the rough table, the two chairs that didn't match, the stone fireplace that had a crack along the left side of the lintel, the shelves along the back wall. And he watched her take inventory. Her face moved through several things quickly. He couldn't name all of them. "It's clean," she said finally, which was generous, because it was clean, he had made sure of that, but it was also stark in the way that spaces get when they've held only one person for a long time, and that person has no interest in decoration. "The roof is sound," he said. "The stove draws well. The well is 30 feet out the back door and hasn't gone dry in 7 years. Practical things," she said. "I told you I was a practical man." She stepped all the way in and set her canvas bag on the table and turned slowly to take in the room. Her eyes stopped on the shelves. He knew they would. He had thought about that during the 2-hour drive, about what she would make of the shelves. He'd thought about rearranging them, which would have been obvious and stupid, or covering them with a blanket, which would have been worse. In the end, he'd left them exactly as they were. She walked to the shelves. They ran the full width of the back wall, floor to near ceiling, rough pine boards on iron brackets, and they held perhaps 80 books. She read the spine slowly, the way she would. He watched her. Blackstone's commentaries, the complete works of Shakespeare, Thoreau, a survey of territorial land law, a farmer's almanac for 1871, a medical text, a collection of poetry he'd bought because it was $1 and he had been curious, 6 novels, 2 volumes of history, a surveyor's manual. These belonged to the previous owners, he said. He said it before he could stop himself. He hadn't planned to say it. The words came out with the automatic ease of something that had been rehearsed without his permission, a lie that his brain had apparently prepared while the rest of him wasn't looking. It was the simplest explanation. It answered the obvious question before she could ask it, and it was completely false. Eleanor turned from the shelves. She looked at him for a moment with those quick, dark eyes, and he could not tell whether she believed him or not, and he could not ask. "There are a lot of them," she said, which meant nothing and possibly meant everything. "The previous owner was a reader," he said, digging deeper into it, piling words on top of the first lie the way you pile dirt on a thing you've buried. "Apparently," she said. She turned back to the shelves and pulled out the Thoreau. She opened it. He knew what she would find, and he had no way to stop her finding it, and he stood very still. She turned the pages slowly. It had been an old copy when he bought it, and he had read it twice, and there were places where the paper had worn soft under hands that had touched it repeatedly. Nothing written in it. He had never written in books. It wasn't a habit he'd developed. But the wear was its own kind of evidence. The spine was broken in 3 places, at passages he had returned to often. She closed it and put it back on the shelf. "I'll start with the legal matters," she said. "You mentioned in your letter that there were some land disputes. I'd like to see the documents first." He got the documents. The land dispute was with a man named Aldous Greer, who had been grazing cattle on Silas's south pasture for 2 seasons on the argument that an 1869 survey had placed the boundary line 20 rods east of where Silas maintained it actually was. The Carthen County Land Office had records that supported Silas, but those records were in conflict with a secondary survey commissioned by Greer's lawyer, a man from Denver who had come up specifically to make trouble, and the whole thing had been festering in correspondence and counter-correspondence for over a year. Eleanor sat at the table with the documents spread before her and read through all of it in silence for the better part of an hour while Silas made coffee and tried not to watch her. He watched her anyway, at intervals, because he couldn't help it. She read carefully. She went back to earlier documents when later ones referenced them. She made small notes on a separate piece of paper. Her own paper, from her bag, not his. In handwriting so small he would have needed to be closer to read it. "The secondary survey is flawed," she said, without looking up. "I know. It references a landmark, a granite outcropping they're calling Greer's Stone, as the eastern boundary marker. But this earlier survey, Oki," she tapped a document, "describes the same boundary by reference to Ridgeline Creek and places the marker at a specific distance from the water. If Greer's Stone isn't on the creek, the whole secondary survey falls apart. The stone is 40 feet from the creek," he said. She looked up. "How do you know that?" "I measured it." She held his gaze for a moment. "And you never put that in writing?" "There was nobody to put it in writing for me," he said. The words came out flat, and he heard them land, and he watched her hear them, and for a moment something passed across her face that he couldn't name, and she looked back down at the documents. "I can write a letter to the land office," she said. "I'll reference the original survey and request that the boundary be remeasured from the creek marker. If you can testify to the distance of the stone, we have a strong case." "All right. I'll need paper and ink." He showed her where he kept them. She didn't comment on the quality of the paper, which was good, or the fact that he kept 3 different pen nibs of varying thickness, which was the kind of detail that meant something. She wrote for the rest of the afternoon. He went back outside to work. The arrangement of the cabin presented its own set of complications that neither of them had fully thought through in the abstract. There was one bedroom. It held a bed that Silas had built himself from rough pine, wide enough for one person and reasonably comfortable if that person was not particularly large. He was particularly large. He had managed by sleeping slightly diagonally. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the bedroom on the first evening and looked at the situation with the same clear-eyed pragmatism she seemed to bring to everything. "That won't fit both of us," she said. "No." "I'll take the bedroom," she said. "You can have the—" She glanced at the main room. "The floor by the fire? Or I can take the floor and you can have the bed, since it's your bed. I'm not particular about it." "I'll take the floor," he said. "I've slept on worse." "So have I, probably," she said, and went to get her trunk. He lay on his bedroll that first night, listening to the cabin settle and breathe around him, and he thought about the fact that there was a stranger in his bedroom, and that he had put her there, and that the entire reason she was here was a lie he still hadn't told her. He thought, "I'll tell her in the morning." He did not tell her in the morning, Bashum. The mornings fell into a pattern before either of them decided on one, which was how patterns usually happen in places where practicality mattered more than preference. Eleanor was up before light. He didn't know whether that was her habit or whether she slept badly in the unfamiliar space. He didn't ask. She made coffee with the particular economy of someone who had been making their own coffee for years, and she had it ready when he came back from the morning check of the animals, which he did before first light as a habit so old he didn't think of it as a habit anymore. They drank coffee across the table from each other in the near dark and didn't talk much. It wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised him. He had anticipated the presence of another person in the cabin being a kind of friction, a constant low-grade awareness, an obligation to account for himself, to explain and navigate. Instead, she moved through the space with a self-containment that matched his own, and they built around each other the way two people build around shared furniture. She cooked in the evenings. She had said adequately in her letter, and she meant it. She cooked plain food that was hot and sufficient, with occasional mistakes that she acknowledged without drama and fixed or didn't fix depending on whether it was worth fixing. He didn't complain about the mistakes. He had been eating his own cooking for 11 years, and his own cooking was worse. In return, he brought in wood and water without being asked, and he fixed the hinge on the root cellar door that had been sticking all winter. And when the first hard rain of April came through the corner of the bedroom ceiling, she had shown him the wet spot on the boards without accusation, and he had patched it the next morning. "Thank you," she said. "You said the roof was sound," she said. "Most of it is." She almost smiled. It was a small thing, a brief pull at the corner of her mouth that she didn't quite commit to, but he saw it. He began in those first weeks to understand what she had meant about not being good at being smaller than she was. She had opinions, specific, reasoned opinions, about the management of the land, the organization of the legal documents, the best placement of the kitchen garden she'd decided to put in along the south face of the cabin wall. She didn't state them aggressively. She didn't push. She simply had them, clearly and fully formed, and she expressed them as if she expected them to be taken seriously. When they were taken seriously, she moved forward. When they weren't, she didn't sulk. She explained her reasoning once, and then dropped it. He found that he almost always agreed with her once he heard the reasoning. The kitchen garden was a good idea. The south face got the most light, and the soil there was better drained. He'd known that and hadn't done anything with it. "How long have you been here alone?" she asked one afternoon while she was turning the garden soil, and he was mending a stretch of rail fence nearby. 11 years, he said. She stopped working. She looked at him over the fence. "That's a long time." "Yes." "Was it by choice?" He considered the question. The honest answer was complicated in the way that honest answers about 11 years of anything tend to be. "Mostly," he said. She nodded and went back to turning soil and didn't push on it, which he appreciated more than he could have explained. She began writing home to her family in the third week. He knew this because he saw her at the table after supper, when the work of the day was done and the light was going gold and low, with paper and ink, and the particular set of her shoulders that meant she was composing something rather than copying it. She wrote for long periods without stopping, which meant she was writing to people she knew rather than drafting something formal. He did not read the letters. He told himself that several times, the way you tell yourself something you're not quite sure you believe. I will not read her letters. He didn't read them that week. The following week she left one on the table overnight. She'd sealed and addressed it and left it out to take into Ridgeline on his Thursday supply run, and he brought it in from the table when he cleared the breakfast things and set it on the shelf by the door where he kept outgoing mail. The seal was good. He didn't touch it. He thought about it intermittently all morning. He told himself, she is writing to her mother and sister about her life here, which is her private business, and reading it would be a violation of trust. He kept telling himself that. He did not read it. He held to that for 3 weeks. The letter he finally read was not one she'd sent, but one she was drafting, and he read it by accident, or at least by accident enough that he could maintain the distinction for approximately 48 hours before he stopped being able to. She had left a draft on the table, a first attempt that she'd apparently abandoned in favor of rewriting, and it was sitting face up when he came in from the barn, mud-covered and tired, looking for nowhere in particular to put down the leather harness he was carrying. He set the harness on the chair. He looked for something to wipe his hands on. His eyes moved across the table, and the draft was there, and he saw 3 words before he could stop himself. He is not. 3 words. That was all. Then the paper was turned over in his mind's eye, and he was setting it back down and going to the wash basin, and he stood there for a full minute with his hands in the cold water, not quite processing. He is not what? He stood at the wash basin for too long. Then he went back to the table, and he picked up the paper, and he read it. He is not what I expected, Mama, and I don't know yet whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or simply a thing. He's very quiet. He is competent in a way that is almost unsettling. I keep finding things that have been fixed or arranged or prepared that I didn't ask for and didn't notice him doing. He doesn't seem to want anything from me. I mean that in the literal sense. He doesn't ask for much. He doesn't seem to require conversation or entertainment or the usual things people seem to need from other people. I thought at first that he was unfriendly. I think now that he is private in a way I haven't encountered before. The cabin is rougher than I thought it would be, but there is something in it I can't explain. A quality of care in the way things are built, the way the shelves are loaded and level, the way the chimney draws. Someone built this place to last. I think it was him. What I cannot reconcile is the books. He stopped. He set the paper down. He picked it up. He says they belong to previous owners, and I have no reason to disbelieve him. But there are 80 books on those shelves, Mama, and they are read. I don't mean they are present or decorative. I mean they are worn in the specific way that books wear when they have passed through hands many times. The Thoreau is almost falling apart at 3 different places. I keep coming back to this, and I don't know what to make of it. Perhaps the previous owners were great readers. Perhaps some people build their libraries and leave them behind. I have seen it happen. I keep looking at the Thoreau. He put the letter down. He stood in the cabin in the late afternoon light, and the fire was burning low, and outside the wind was starting up the way it did in evenings here, and he felt the specific quality of shame that comes not from a single mistake, but from watching a mistake grow roots. She kept looking at the Thoreau. He thought, she knows. He thought, she doesn't know. She suspects. He thought, she is exactly the kind of person who will not let it go. He thought all of these things, and he folded the draft carefully and put it back exactly as he'd found it, face up on the table, and he went back outside to finish with the harness. And the evening came down around the mountain the way evenings did, slow and heavy and blue. That night, across the fire, he looked at her, and she was reading one of the novels from the shelf, a thing she'd pulled down and never commented on and simply started reading, which was its own kind of statement. And he thought about saying, Eleanor, there's something I should have told you before you came. She turned a page. He didn't say anything. He read the letters after that. Not all of them, not immediately, but the first one was a kind of crack in a wall, and walls with cracks don't hold, and he knew that, and he read them anyway. He read them when she left drafts on the table. He read the ones left for the post before he brought them into Ridgeline, opening and resealing them with the particular care of a man who understood exactly how wrong what he was doing was and could not stop doing it. He told himself each time that it was the last time. What he found in those letters, what undid him, slowly and then completely, was not information but texture. She was funny in her letters to her sister in a way she wasn't quite in the cabin. Not that she was humorless here. That small, near smile had become more familiar over the weeks. But in the letters, she was loose with it, letting it sprawl. His horse looks at me with an expression of deep personal offense whenever I enter the barn, as if I am violating something sacred by existing near him. I have concluded that the horse was here before me, and has a prior claim he intends to defend. She was afraid of failing in a way she would never have admitted out loud. I keep thinking, Mama, that I will do something irreversibly wrong, something that cannot be fixed with an apology and a new arrangement. I do not know what it would be. I only know that there are things I cannot repair, and that fear sits in me quietly, most days, like a stone I keep forgetting is there until I move. She noticed things. Everything. The way the light came through the east window in the morning, the sound the creek made in thaw, the specific way Silas, he read these parts with the particular discomfort of reading your own name in a document you were not meant to see, the way he goes still when he's thinking about something. Not tense. Still. Like a man who's learned that patience is the same thing as competence. He sat with that one for a long time. She wrote about the land dispute and her excitement when the letter to the land office received a favorable response. Greer's secondary survey had been challenged, a new measurement ordered. She had written that letter entirely herself, from the legal reasoning to the closing, and it had worked, and she described the moment he'd told her about the response with a restraint that he recognized as the outward sign of something much larger moving underneath. He said, "You did good work, and I believe that is the closest he comes to celebration. I think I understand now why silence from him is not the same as indifference. It took me a while to learn the difference." He read that in the barn by lantern light, a Tuesday evening in May. He sat on the milking stool for a long time afterward, the letter held loosely in both hands, listening to the horse shift and settle in the next stall over. He was in serious trouble, not because he had been reading her letters, though that was its own separate problem, a significant one. One he was not going to be able to outrun forever. He was in trouble because the woman those letters described was not the arranged practical partnership he had been prepared for. The woman those letters described was someone who could not pretend to be smaller than she was and meant it, who was afraid but kept moving, who paid attention with a quality of attention that felt like a form of respect. And he had been reading her private mind for 6 weeks, and she did not know it. And what he felt when he read her letters was not the guilty thrill of access to forbidden things, but something quieter and considerably more dangerous. He felt known, which was absurd because she didn't know him. She knew an incomplete version of him, a version that was missing a central fact, and the central fact was that everything she believed about why she was here was wrong. He folded the letter carefully and resealed it and took it into town on Thursday and added it to the post. And he rode home in the late afternoon light, with the mountains doing what they always did in that light, going gold and then blue and then that particular purple that had no name and didn't need one. And he thought about Eleanor Hart in his cabin, writing letters about a man she was only beginning to understand. And he thought about the cedar chest under the floor where he kept important documents. And he thought, she deserves the truth. He thought, I will tell her. He thought, I will tell her before this goes any further. The horse picked its own way home in the failing light, and the wind moved through the pines the way it always did, like something with a purpose it hadn't chosen to share. And Silas Rowan held the reins loosely and made the same quiet, fatal decision he had been making since March. He said nothing. And the summer came on. Summer on Blackridge was not the relief that people who hadn't lived through the winters imagined it would be. It was its own kind of brutal. The heat came in hard and dry. The creek dropped 3 feet by July, and the work didn't slow down because the season changed. If anything, it accelerated, stacking itself into the long days with the particular urgency of a place that understood winter was coming back and didn't care how tired you were. Eleanor learned this without anyone having to tell her. By mid-June, she had reorganized the root cellar, written 4 letters on behalf of the ranch, 2 to the land office, 1 to a lumber supplier in Carthen who had shorted them on a delivery, and 1 to a lawyer named Beckford in Denver who Silas had mentioned once, briefly, in connection with a title question he'd been trying to resolve for 3 years. The Beckford letter was the most complicated, and she had drafted it twice before she was satisfied, citing specific sections of territorial land code she'd found in one of the law volumes on the back shelf. That one she was quietly proud of, though she told nobody, including Silas, and especially not her mother. The title question was resolved inside of 6 weeks. Silas read Beckford's response at the table one morning while Eleanor was in the kitchen garden, and he sat with it for a while, and when she came in, he handed it across without comment. She read it and looked up. That's it? She said. That's it. 3 years, she said. I didn't have the right words for it before. She set the letter down, and he watched something move across her face. Not pride exactly, more like a quiet satisfaction that she was also slightly embarrassed by, and she turned back to the garden before it could fully form. But he'd seen it, and he kept it. They were still sleeping in separate spaces. The arrangement had not changed, her in the bedroom, him on the floor by the fire, and neither of them had suggested changing it. It was the thing that sat most obviously between them, the question that had no clear answer because neither of them had agreed on what their arrangement actually was. The Bureau's paperwork described them as married. They had signed documents. But the space between a legal signature and an actual life together was large, and neither of them had found a natural way to close it. He told himself that was fine, that there was no hurry, that two people who were essentially strangers had reason to be careful. What he did not tell himself was that he read her letters every week and knew her far better than she knew him, and that the asymmetry of that was its own kind of intimacy, one-sided, private, and increasingly impossible to justify. She wrote to her sister Clara in late June, I have begun to suspect that the awkwardness between us is not indifference on his part. I think he simply does not know how to begin things. Neither do I, if I'm being honest. We have become very good at working alongside each other and very poor at everything else. I keep waiting for one of us to say something real, and neither of us does. It's like watching two people each waiting for the other to open a door that neither one of them is sure leads anywhere good. He read that on the Thursday ride into Ridgeline and stared at the road for a long stretch afterward. He thought, she is more perceptive than is convenient. He thought, she thinks the awkwardness is mutual shyness. He thought, she is right that it's partly that, and wrong about what the other part is. He brought the letter in and added it to the post and bought flour and a new draw knife and a spool of wire for the fence repair he had planned for the following week. And on the way home he made, for possibly the 12th time, a decision to tell her the truth. For possibly the 12th time he got back to the cabin and found her at the table working through a set of accounts for the fall grazing fees, focused and precise, and the moment dissolved before he could find the entrance to it. The summer pressed on. There was an afternoon in July that he did not plan, and that changed something between them in a way that was real, and therefore made everything worse. He was repairing the section of fence along the south pasture, the Greer boundary, now confirmed and marked with fresh stakes following the land office's remeasurement. When the sky went wrong fast, the way mountain skies did, green and low and moving with the particular speed that meant you had less time than you thought. He had his tools, and the fence was half done, and the horse was tied 100 yards away near the tree line, and he looked at the sky and made a decision. He started moving. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden when the first crack of thunder came in, and he could see her from the pasture. A small gray figure that straightened and looked north at the sky, and then immediately started pulling tools. She didn't run. She worked fast and methodical, covering the seedbed she'd been tending with burlap weighed down by stones, not trying to save everything, saving what was worth saving. He watched her make those choices quickly and correctly, and then he was close enough to call out. Get inside, he said. In a minute. Now, Eleanor. She looked at him. The wind was picking up hard and her hair had come loose and was doing things she was probably unaware of, and the light had gone, that particular greenish yellow that meant hail was a real possibility. The tomato starts will die if they get hailed on, she said. They might die anyway, he said. Get inside. Something moved across her face. Annoyance at being told, recognition that he was right, neither winning cleanly. And she grabbed the last corner of the burlap, and the wind immediately tried to take it, and he reached over and held it down while she tied it, and they were very close together for a moment, both pulling against the wind. And then the first hail came in sideways, and they ran. They made it to the cabin porch just before it got truly bad. He pulled the door open, and she went in, and he came in after her, and they stood in the main room breathing hard, while the hail hammered the roof with a sound like the world coming apart at the seams. Is the roof going to hold? She asked. It held last year. That's not the same as yes. It's what I've got, he said. She almost laughed. Not quite. The storm was still too loud and close for quite, but almost. And he heard it and felt something shift in his chest, small and specific, like something that had been held at an angle for a long time, moving into a better position. They stood in the cabin while the hail came down and it was fine. The roof held. The tomato starts survived under the burlap, 4 out of 6 of them, which Eleanor reported the following morning with the kind of satisfaction that was exactly proportionate to the stakes involved. Real, but not dramatic. She wrote to Clara about it that week. He read it Thursday. There was a hailstorm and we ran inside together and we were both out of breath, and the noise was... it was loud. Clara, you can't imagine what hail sounds like on a mountain roof. It's like standing inside a drum. And we stood there in the middle of the cabin, and for a minute we were just 2 people who had been in the same storm and made it inside. And it was the most normal I have felt since I arrived. I think that is strange, but I think it might be important. He read that standing in the street in Ridgeline, and he stood there long enough that the general store owner's boy, who was sweeping the porch, gave him an odd look and went back inside. He put the letter in the post. He rode home. He fixed the fence. The summer went. Autumn came in with smoke and color and a sense of urgency that everyone on the mountain understood. There was not a week in September or October that didn't have a list attached to it. Wood to be split and stacked, the root cellar to be packed in a specific order that Eleanor had worked out from a combination of her mother's instructions and her own reasoning, hay to be brought in, the animals to be checked and supplemented and prepared for what was coming. They worked together in those months in a way that moved past the careful politeness of the summer and into something more functional and less self-conscious. She learned to read the sky. He noticed that the way she started checking it in the mornings before deciding on the day's work, the way she adjusted without being told when the weather said the outdoor project had to wait. He didn't mention it. It would have embarrassed her, or she would have deflected it, and either way the moment would have been lost. He simply noticed. She learned the horse who had regarded her for the first 2 months with the deep personal grievance she had described to Clara, eventually permitted her presence with the diminishing suspicion of a very proud creature whose pride had run into the harder fact of someone who showed up every morning with something useful. By October she could handle him on her own, which she accomplished without drama or announcement, simply appearing one morning with him tacked up and ready when Silas came out of the barn. "When did that happen?" he asked. "Gradually," she said, and swung up. There were evenings in October after supper when they sat by the fire and didn't speak, but the silence had a different texture than it had in April. Less watchful, more settled. She read from the shelf novels. She was methodical about it, working left to right, and had gotten through 4 of them by the time the first snow came, and she never commented on them directly except once, when she closed the Shakespeare and said to nobody in particular, "Whoever owned these before took very good care of them." And he kept his face still and said nothing. She was still looking at the Thoreau. He knew because she wrote about it to her mother in November. "There is something about the way it is worn that I cannot explain or dismiss. I keep returning to the same question, and I have no good answer for it." The man who supposedly couldn't read, and I know I am not supposed to call that into question, it's not my business to interrogate. But the man who couldn't read chose to keep 80 books on his shelves rather than use the space for something practical. He builds the shelves level to within 1/8 of an inch. He organized the law volumes by subject. "I'm going to stop writing about this now because I think if I write it plainly, I will have to do something about it, and I am not sure I'm ready to." He read that one on a gray Tuesday in November, standing in the barn where the light was bad and the cold was starting to mean business, and he held the letter in both hands and read it twice, and then stood there for a long time listening to the horse breathe in the next stall. She was almost there. He had maybe 1 winter. The first real snow came the 2nd week of November, which was early even by Blackridge standards. And it came mean, not the gentle leading-edge snow that sometimes preceded the serious winter, but 6 inches overnight and more behind it, the kind of opening move that told you the season wasn't interested in courtesy this year. He woke to find Eleanor already at the stove, already dressed, already taking stock. "How bad does it get?" she asked without preamble. "Worse than this." "How much worse?" He told her honestly. The drifts against the north wall in hard years, the creek freezing solid by January, the weeks sometimes when the road to Ridgeline was impassable and you lived entirely off what you had stored. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she nodded once, the way she did when she was processing information and converting it into a list of things to do. "The root cellar is stocked well," she said. "I over-ordered the dried beans in September. I thought it was excessive at the time. It wasn't. No, she agreed. You did good work, he said, which was what he had said about the Greer letter, and she received it the same way she had then. A small stillness, not quite acknowledgement, more like someone taking a breath before moving on. They were snowed in for 11 days in December. It was a different kind of proximity than the summer had been. In the summer there was always outside, always the field or the garden or the barn to retreat to, physical space between them that the work created naturally. Inside in the snow, with the fire the center of everything, and the windows opaque with white, and the temperature outside falling past things he stopped telling her about because the numbers weren't helpful, they were together in a way that had nowhere to hide. He learned small things about her that the letters hadn't told him. She talked to herself when she was working through a problem. Not full sentences, more like partial fragments that she murmured while her hands were doing something else. She was afraid of running out of kerosene for the lamp, which she didn't say directly, but which he deduced from the way she rationed it with a precision she didn't apply to other things. She had a habit when she was tired of rubbing the back of her left hand with her right thumb, a small automatic gesture that she seemed unaware of. He didn't write any of this down. He didn't tell anyone. He stored it with the rest of what he knew about her and tried not to examine the fact that he was storing it. Tell me something about before, she said one evening, the 8th night of the 11. The fire was good, and she was sitting on the floor near it because the chair had gotten uncomfortable, and he was at the table with a harness he was working on by feel and habit more than necessity. Before what? He said. Before here, before Blackridge. Where did you come from? He was quiet for a moment, not because the question bothered him, but because he was sorting through what was true and what was worth saying. Ohio, he said. Grew up in a town called Millfield. My father farmed. I farmed with him until I was 22, and then I didn't want to do that anymore, so I went west. Just like that? More or less. She turned to look at him. Was there a reason? He kept working the harness. The farm wasn't big enough for two opinions. She laughed. A real one, full and quick and a little surprised, like laughter that got out before she could decide whether to let it. It changed her face entirely. He had not heard her laugh like that before, and the sound of it did something to the air in the cabin. I understand that, she said. My father's house had the same problem. Is that why you're here? Partly, she said. Partly it's... I told you in the letter. The men who wanted to marry me wanted a particular kind of wife. She paused. She was looking at the fire now. My father used to say I thought too much. He meant it as a criticism. I don't think I'll ever stop thinking too much, so I stopped trying to be somewhere that asked me to. The fire moved. Outside, the wind pushed at the shutters. You don't think too much, he said. She looked at him. You think the right amount, he said. It's useful. Another pause. Longer this time. He kept his eyes on the harness. Silas, she said, and the way she said his name, not sharp, not weighted with anything specific, just direct, made him set the harness down and look at her. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Nothing. Never mind. She turned back to the fire. He picked up the harness. He thought about that exchange for the remaining 3 nights of the snowstorm and reached no useful conclusion except that he had spent 6 months in close proximity to a woman who did not hide what she thought, and he was still managing to hide the most important thing about himself. And at some point those two facts were going to meet each other directly. He already knew how it would feel when they did. The snow broke in January briefly, and then came back in earnest in February. The second storm of February was the worst of the season. A week of sustained cold that drove snow into every gap and seam of the cabin, that turned the world outside the window into a uniform white nothing, that made the walk to the barn each morning a significant undertaking and not something to be careless about. He showed her the rope line he'd strung between the cabin and the barn door, the first winter thing he'd established when he came to Blackridge. In the bad storms, he said, you follow the rope. You don't navigate by sight. You go by feel. She held the rope and looked at him with something in her expression that he couldn't fully read. What if the rope isn't there? She asked. You don't go out without it, he said. She wrote about that to Clara in a letter she composed in early March, when the worst of the winter was beginning, only beginning, to tire of itself. He showed me the guide rope between the cabin and the barn. You follow the rope, he said, not your eyes. I've been thinking about that sentence for a week. I think it might be the most important thing he has told me since I arrived. I think it might be about more than the barn. He read that one sitting in the wagon on the Thursday drive to Ridgeline, parked just outside of town, where the road bent around a stand of pine that blocked the view from the street. And he sat there in the cold with the horse standing patient and steaming, and the letter in his bare hands because he'd taken his gloves off to open it. He sat there for a long time. He was reading her the way she was starting to read him. The difference was that she didn't know it, and he did. And that difference was the rope line he had strung between them. The one that was supposed to keep someone safe in the dark, but that, pulled hard enough in the wrong direction, would bring everything down. He folded the letter. He resealed it carefully. He drove into town and added it to the post and bought what he needed and drove home in the late afternoon, the mountains doing what they always did in that light, indifferent and enormous and extraordinarily beautiful. Spring, he thought. He would tell her in the spring. The winter wasn't done with them yet. March came in the way it always did on Blackridge. Not as a relief, but as a negotiation. The snow didn't leave so much as it retreated, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first and holding its ground everywhere else, leaving the world half-thawed and half-frozen and entirely treacherous underfoot. The creek started talking again under its ice. The light came back in a way that was almost physical, longer days that landed against the snowfields and bounced up into the cabin windows at angles that hadn't existed since October. Eleanor noticed the light the way she noticed most things, specifically and without making a performance of it. She moved the table 6 inches to the left one morning to catch the east window better, and when Silas came in for midday coffee, he registered the change without comment and sat in the new position of the light, as if it had always been there. She was writing more now. Not because the legal work had increased. If anything, the winter had slowed that down, there being limited opportunity to create new disputes when everyone was more or less buried under the same snow. But because the letters home had grown longer and more frequent, and he knew it, and he knew why, or thought he did. She was sorting something out. He could see it in the letters without having to read between many lines. She was taking stock of a year on the mountain, what she had believed when she arrived, what she had learned since, what she still could not reconcile. The questions she came back to were consistent and specific. The books, the way he read the legal documents she set before him, the way he sometimes finished a sentence in a way that suggested he had already considered its implications before she finished saying it. She hadn't confronted him directly. She was too careful for that, or too uncertain, or both. But she was circling. He felt it the way you feel a change in weather on the mountain. Not by seeing it, but by something in the air, a shift in pressure, a quality of waiting. He was afraid. He was not a man who admitted fear easily, not to himself and not to anyone else, but sitting with it honestly in those March evenings, he recognized it clearly enough. He was afraid of the look on her face when she finally put it together completely. He was afraid of what she would see when she measured the man against the deception, not just the original misunderstanding he had failed to correct, but the months of letters, the deliberate opening and resealing, the accumulated knowledge of her private mind that she had never once offered him directly. He was afraid she would leave. That was the whole of it, underneath everything else. He was afraid she would leave, which meant he had something to lose, which meant somewhere in the long, strange year of cooking plain food and sitting across the fire in comfortable silence and reading her most private thoughts like a man with no conscience, he had stopped thinking of this arrangement as temporary or provisional and had started thinking of it as his life. That was inconvenient to realize, given the circumstances. The first week of March brought a short, warm spell, 3 days of genuine thaw that were almost certainly a lie the season was telling before it made one more serious push. And Eleanor used them to get outside, to pull the burlap off the kitchen garden and assess what had survived and what hadn't, to walk the south fence line and note where the freeze had pushed posts out of plumb. He watched her move through the half-thawed field with a clipboard she had acquired somewhere, and a pencil, and her boots leaving dark prints in the softening mud, and he thought, she belongs here now. It was not a sentimental observation, it was practical. She had learned the place. She knew where to step and where not to, which areas of the south pasture stayed wet, how far you could push the horse before he decided he'd had enough. She had earned that knowledge the way all genuine knowledge gets earned, by making mistakes in real conditions and paying attention to what they cost. She wrote to her mother that week, "I think I will stay. I don't mean that as a dramatic announcement. I mean only that when I imagine leaving, the thing I feel is not relief. That seems like useful information." He read that on the Thursday run in good weather for the first time in months, the road soft and the sky doing something tentatively blue, and he thought, "I have until she writes the next one." He didn't know exactly what he meant by that. He only knew that it had the specific weight of a deadline. The next letter she wrote was the one that ended everything. It was a Thursday in mid-March. He had come back from Ridgeline with the mail, which included a letter from her mother. Thick paper, firm handwriting that he recognized from the return address on Eleanor's outgoing letters. And he had set it on the table with the other mail and gone out to unload the wagon. When he came back in, she was at the table reading it, and the coffee was hot. And she looked up at him with an expression that was lighter than usual. Something loosened in it. "My mother writes that she received my account of the land dispute," she said. "She's impressed. She says she didn't know I could read legal documents." "You taught yourself?" he said, and poured the coffee. "From your law books," she said. And then, easily, without apparent design, "She also says she received your response." He set the coffee pot down. He set it down carefully, without hurrying, the way you move when something inside you has gone very still. "My response," he said, "to her last letter. She says you wrote to her in December." Eleanor was still looking at her mother's letter, reading ahead. "I didn't know you had done that. That was kind." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire was doing what fires did, the small shifting sounds of burning wood that you stopped hearing after a while and only noticed again when everything else stopped. Outside, the brief thaw was doing something to the eaves, a slow drip of meltwater that had been going since morning. Silas stood at the counter with the coffee cup in his hand, and he was very aware of the weight of it, the specific temperature of the ceramic against his palm. He had written to her mother in December. He had read a letter from her mother in November, a letter Eleanor had left on the table for the post, sealed, addressed. And her mother had said something in it about worrying whether Eleanor was eating well enough in the mountain winter and whether the man she had married was a decent sort of person. And he had opened the letter, which was wrong. And he had read those specific worried mother sentences, and he had done something he had not done before and had not let himself fully account for afterward. He had written back, not under Eleanor's name, under his own. A brief letter, 2 paragraphs, saying that Eleanor was well, that she had handled the winter with more capability than he had expected, that she was eating adequately, and he was making sure of it, and that the man her mother was worried about had no intention of being anything other than decent. He had sealed it separately and sent it with Eleanor's letter on the same Thursday run, and he had told himself it was a reasonable thing to do and had not examined it closely enough to discover that it was also an impossible thing to do. If he couldn't read, he couldn't have written it. If he couldn't read, he couldn't have known what her mother had said to warrant a response. If he couldn't read, none of it was possible, and Eleanor's mother had apparently written back acknowledging his letter, which meant Eleanor was holding in her hands the evidence of an impossibility. He watched her face. He watched the moment she got there. It was not dramatic. Her expression didn't collapse or shatter. She went still, the way water goes still before it reflects something clearly. And she read the sentence again, and then she looked up from the letter and across the kitchen at him. And her eyes were doing the fast, precise work they always did, only now they were doing it directly on him, and there was nothing between them. "Silas," she said, his name, the way she said it, not sharp, worse than sharp, quiet and level, and asking a question that was not a question. "Yes," he said, "my mother says you responded to her letter about the kerosene lamp." She held his gaze. "The letter where she asked if I was keeping the lamp well trimmed. She says you told her I was managing it fine." He said nothing. "The lamp," Eleanor said again. And now there was something entering her voice that was not quite anger, not yet. It was closer to the specific quality of a person watching a wall they believed was solid reveal itself to be paper. "Silas, the letter about the kerosene lamp was sealed. I sealed it myself. I sent it in October." "I know," he said. The 2 words hung in the kitchen. Her face moved through something he could not follow. Too fast. Too many things at once. She set her mother's letter down on the table very carefully, as if she was not entirely sure her hands were reliable, and she stood up and she looked at him. and the look was one he had not seen from her before and would not forget. "How long?" she said. "Not how long have you been able to read?" She was past that question. She was at the one underneath it. "How long have you been reading my letters?" she said. The fire, the meltwater on the eaves, the specific weight of the coffee cup in his hand. "Since May," he said. The sound she made was not a word. It was brief and involuntary, and it told him more than anything she could have put into a sentence. She turned away from him toward the window, and he watched her back, the set of her shoulders, the way she stood when she was working something through that was too large to sit still with. "May," she said to the window. "Yes." "That's—" She stopped, started again. "That's almost a year." "Yes." "Every letter." He didn't answer because the answer was yes, and she already knew it. She turned around and looked at him, and her eyes were dry and bright and furious in a way that was worse than tears would have been. "I wrote to my mother that I was afraid I was failing," she said. "In June. I wrote that I thought I might not be suited for this, and I was afraid to admit it. I wrote things to Clara that I have never said out loud to any person." Her voice was level, but the levelness cost something. He could hear what it cost. "Those were private, Silas. They were mine." "I know," he said. "Then why?" It wasn't a question with a rising inflection. It was flat and direct, and it required an actual answer, not a deflection. And he knew it, and he stood there in the kitchen in the March light with the coffee going cold in his hand, and he said the only honest thing he had. "I didn't know how to stop." She stared at him. "That's not enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She crossed the kitchen and took her coat from the hook by the door, her movements sharp and efficient in the way they got when she was managing something large by keeping her body busy. She pushed her feet into her boots without sitting down, a thing he'd never seen her do. And she pulled the door open and the cold March air came in, and she walked out onto the porch and down the steps, and he watched her from the window go across the thawed mud of the yard toward the south fence line, where the ground opened up into the first real view of the valley below. She stood there with her back to the cabin, her coat pulled around her, and she was very still. He set the coffee cup down. He did not follow her immediately. He stood in the kitchen, and he looked at the table where her mother's letter lay, and he looked at the shelf where the Thoreau sat, with its broken spine, and he thought about the 11 days of the December snowstorm. The evening she had said, nothing, never mind, and turned back to the fire, and the February morning she had taken the horse out herself without saying anything, and the night of the hailstorm when they had stood in the cabin together out of breath, and the noise was all around them, and for 1 minute they had been simply two people who had made it inside. He thought about the letter in October. "I keep waiting for one of us to say something real." She had been waiting. He had been reading. He found his coat and went outside. She heard him coming. The mud announced every footstep, and she didn't turn around. He came to stand beside her at the fence line, and they stood looking out at the valley together, and the valley was doing its particular March thing, the snow line visible on the far ridge, the lower slopes going brown and gray, the creek a dark line through the middle of it all. "How long have you been able to read?" she said finally. She was not looking at him. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Always," he said. "My whole life." A pause, long enough to feel the full shape of it. "Always," she repeated. "The Bureau made an error in my file. I should have corrected it. I didn't." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted to give her the true one, not the one that sounded better. "Your letter," he said, "the one you sent to the Bureau. I read it before I replied, and it was the most honest thing I had read in a long time. And I thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought that if I corrected the mistake, you would come here and be competent and manage the letters, and we would have a practical arrangement, and you would never write me anything like that letter again. Because you'd have no reason to." She turned and looked at him. Her face was hard to read in the way that faces are hard to read when too many things are happening in them simultaneously. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "I know. You thought that letting me believe a lie was the way to get to know me?" When she put it that way, which was the accurate way, it sounded exactly as bad as it was. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment and then looked back at the valley, and he watched her jaw work slightly, the way it did when she was choosing between several possible things to say. "You read the letter in June," she said. "The one where I said I was afraid I was failing." "Yes." "And you didn't—" She stopped. "You were there. We ate supper that night. You fixed the gate hinge. You told me the fence was good work." "Yes." "But you knew I was afraid." "Yes." "And you didn't say anything." "No." She turned to look at him again, and this time there was something different in it, past the fury. Something more complicated and in some ways harder to face. "Why not?" she said. "If you knew, if you read it, why didn't you just—" She made a short, frustrated gesture that was not like her. The contained kind of frustration that escapes when containment runs out. "Why didn't you say something? You didn't have to tell me you'd read the letter. You could have just said something, anything." He held her gaze. "Because anything I said would have been built on something you didn't know," he said. "And you told me in the first letter you ever wrote me that you needed someone who would tell you the truth." She went very still. "So you said nothing," she said. "So I said nothing," he agreed, "which is worse." The wind came through from the north, the last cold edge of the winter still in it, and she pulled her coat tighter and looked out at the valley, and he waited. He was good at waiting. He had 11 years of practice at standing still and letting the difficult thing take as long as it needed. "I need you to go back inside," she said. "All right. I'm not—" She stopped. "I need a few minutes." "Take what you need," he said. He went back to the cabin. He built the fire up because the cold was real, and she didn't have her heaviest coat, and she would come back in eventually, and the cabin needed to be warm when she did. He washed the coffee cups. He stood at the window once and looked out to the south fence line, where her figure was still there, still facing the valley, still very still. He thought about the letter from June, the one where she wrote, "There are things I cannot repair, and that fear sits in me quietly, most days, like a stone I keep forgetting is there until I move." He thought, she was writing to her mother about feeling inadequate, and I was the only one who read it, and I said nothing, and what I protected was not her. It was myself. That was the truest thing he had managed to think in months, and it sat in him like a stone, and he did not try to move away from it. She came back inside after about 20 minutes. Her cheeks were red from the cold and her boots left mud on the floor she didn't comment on, and she went to the fire and held her hands out to it without speaking. He said nothing. He was at the table. He waited. "I want to know what was in them," she said to the fire. "In the letters? What did you read? The things I wrote about being afraid, about the books, about—" Stopped. "I want to know what you know about me that I didn't tell you." It was the hardest question she could have asked, harder than anger, harder than accusation, because it required him to account for everything, not just the mechanism of the deception, but its contents, all the private things he had absorbed and stored and kept. "You were afraid in June," he said slowly. "You thought you might not be suited for this. You were afraid of doing something you couldn't repair. You wrote about the Thoreau, that you couldn't account for it. You told your sister you were waiting for one of us to say something real." He paused. "You wrote to your mother in March that when you imagined leaving, what you felt wasn't relief." The fire snapped. She didn't move. "You wrote that the hailstorm was the most normal you had felt since you arrived," he said. "You wrote about the guide rope. You said it might be about more than the barn." Silence. "You wrote to your mother in November about the Thoreau," he said. "You wrote that if you put it plainly, you would have to do something about it, and you weren't ready." She turned around slowly and looked at him, and her expression was not anger anymore. It was something more exposed than anger, the look of a person who has had the wall between their inside and outside life removed without warning and must now account for the difference. "You knew all of it," she said. "Most of it. While I thought—" She stopped again. "While I was trying to work out who you were, you already knew who I was." He held her gaze and didn't look away, because she deserved that much. "Yes." She stood at the fireplace and looked at him, and outside the March wind worked at the shutters with the patient persistence of a season that was not done yet, and the fire was the warmest thing in the room, and she said, "I need to think." She took her coat off and hung it back on the hook, and she went into the bedroom, and she closed the door, which she had never done before, not once in the whole year, and the sound of it was quiet and final, and it sat in the cabin like a new kind of silence that he did not know how to be in. He sat at the table. The fire burned, the meltwater dripped from the eaves. The valley below the south fence was doing its particular gray and brown March thing, indifferent and ongoing, the way country that has seen many winters remains indifferent to any particular one. He sat there for a long time. He had nothing left to protect now. The lie was gone, all of it. The original misunderstanding, the months of letters, the December note to her mother, all of it exposed and accounted for. What remained was the truth, which was that he had come to know her through her own words and had not stopped and could not have stopped and had no excuse that rose to the level of what that cost her. He was still sitting at the table when the fire burned low enough to need wood, and he got up and added it, and he looked at the closed bedroom door and he thought, she will either stay or go. He thought, and I will tell her everything, and the telling is the only thing left that belongs to me. The bedroom door stayed closed through supper. He made food anyway, salt pork and boiled potatoes, nothing that required attention, food that could sit without suffering. And he left a plate on the table and ate his own at the counter standing up, which was not a habit but felt right for the occasion. The fire burned. The wind had died down outside, the way March winds often did after dark, and the cabin was very quiet in the specific way that spaces become quiet when someone inside them is not speaking. He washed both plates at the end of the evening, hers untouched. He washed it anyway. He did not sleep. He lay on the bedroll by the fire and stared at the ceiling and did the thing he had spent a year avoiding, which was thinking about himself honestly. Not about the situation or the logistics of it or what might happen next, but about the specific person who had made a series of choices that had led to a closed bedroom door and a plate of untouched food and a woman on the other side of a wall who was dealing with a year's worth of betrayal in the dark. He had told himself at various points that he was protecting the arrangement, that correcting the Bureau's mistake would have introduced doubt before anything had a chance to begin, that reading the letters was a kind of knowing, and knowing her was not wrong. He had told himself those things, and had believed enough of them to keep going. What he had not told himself, and what was now unavoidable, was the simpler truth underneath. He had been afraid. Not of losing the arrangement, of being known and found inadequate. 11 years on Blackridge alone had taught him that solitude was survivable, and other people were not particularly reliable, and the safest way to live was to need very little from anyone. He had built that into the structure of his days until it felt like a personality rather than a defense. And then Eleanor Hart had written him a letter that was so free of pretense that it had frightened him in a way the mountain winters never had. And instead of rising to meet it honestly, he had found a way to know her while keeping himself hidden. That was the truth of it. The long, unglamorous, undefendable truth. He was still awake when the gray light started at the window. The bedroom door opened at some point before sunrise, and he heard her moving in the kitchen. The particular sounds of her mourning, the fire being built up, the kettle. And he lay still and waited to see whether she would come to the main room or not. He was not pretending to sleep. He was simply waiting. She came. She set a cup of coffee on the floor near the bedroll, close enough that he would reach it without getting up if he wanted to, and she went and sat in the chair closest to the fire with her own cup, and she looked at him. He sat up. He picked up the coffee. It was exactly as she made it every morning, which meant she had made it with the same hands and the same care she always did. And he understood that as a choice she had made without making it a statement. I was awake most of the night, she said. So was I. She looked into her cup. I kept thinking about June, the letter I wrote to my mother about being afraid I was failing. She looked up at him. A week after that, you fixed the fence on the north side. The section I told you was loose, but that you hadn't gotten to. I thought you'd just remembered. He said nothing because she was working it through and interrupting wasn't his place. And the root cellar, she said. I mentioned in a letter in August that the organization was difficult because I couldn't tell what we had without moving everything. And the next week you built the second shelf tier on the left wall. She paused. I thought you'd noticed it yourself. I had noticed, he said, but the letter was why I moved on it when I did. She nodded slowly, not forgiving, processing. The night of the November storm, she said, when we were snowed in the first time, you made the extra bread. I'd written to Clara that I missed bread that wasn't hard by the second day. Yes. You were responding to the letters, she said. Not to me, to what I wrote. Both, he said. It wasn't calculated, Eleanor. I know how that sounds. But reading what you wrote and knowing what you needed weren't separate things. You were the same person in both places. She looked at him steadily. Except that I didn't know you were reading. No, he said. You didn't. She held the cup in both hands the way she did when the morning was cold and the fire hadn't reached the whole room yet, and she looked at the fire for a while. He waited. He was aware that this was the moment that would determine everything, and he was aware that there was nothing useful he could do in it except be as honest as he knew how to be and let her decide what that was worth. Tell me the truth about the beginning, she said. All of it. Not the Bureau's mistake. I understand that. Tell me why you didn't correct it. He set his coffee down on the floor and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands. And then he looked at her, because she deserved to be looked at when he said this. I had been alone for 11 years, he said. I had made that work. I told myself I preferred it, that the kind of quiet you have when there's nobody else is a better kind of quiet than the other. He stopped. Then I read your letter, the one you sent to the Bureau. You wrote that you couldn't say things you didn't believe just to avoid discomfort, that you couldn't pretend to be smaller than you were to make someone else feel larger. He paused. I read that and I thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought it was the first time I had read something in a long time that sounded like a real person. She was watching him. If I corrected the mistake, he said, you would have come here without a reason, or you wouldn't have come at all. And I had already decided that I wanted to find out whether the person who wrote that letter was the same in person as she was on paper. He stopped again. That was selfish. I know it. I'm not trying to make it sound like something better than it was. It was selfish, she agreed. And then, after a beat, keep going. When you got here, he said, and you started writing home, I didn't plan to read them. The first one I read was an accident, or close enough to one that I let myself call it that. He shook his head at his own hands. After that, I kept reading because you were honest in those letters in a way you weren't quite face to face. Not dishonest here. You were never dishonest. But in the letters, you said the whole thing. You wrote about being afraid and about the books and about not knowing what to make of me. You were trying to work me out. And He stopped. You were reading the answers, she said. Yes. And I knew every time that it was wrong. I knew that what you wrote to your mother and your sister was yours, and I was taking it without asking. I can't make that into something it wasn't. He looked at her directly. I have no defense for it. I'm telling you this because you asked for the truth, and I am done giving you anything else. The fire moved. The early March light was coming through the east window now. The light she had moved the table to catch, and it lay across the floor between them. You wrote to my mother, she said, in December, about the kerosene lamp. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment. She was worried. She had written about whether you were eating right and whether you were being looked after. She didn't say it directly. She said it around the edges, the way she does. And He paused. I didn't want her to worry. You couldn't tell her everything without alarming her. So I told her what I could tell her, which was that you were managing well and I was paying attention. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, barely perceptible, a movement in the set of her jaw. That was the one that gave you away, she said. I know. You were trying to take care of my mother's feelings, she said, using information you had no right to have, in a letter you had no business writing. She said it precisely, as she said most things, laying each piece down clearly. And it was probably the kindest thing anyone has done for my mother in years. He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure whether it was the right moment to. I'm not saying that makes it acceptable, she said quickly. I'm saying... She stopped and pressed her fingers against her mouth briefly, a gesture he had never seen from her, and he understood that she was trying to organize something that didn't organize easily. I know what you're saying, he said quietly. She lowered her hand. Do you? You're saying that the person who did something wrong is the same person who built the second shelf in the root cellar and wrote to your mother in December and fixed the gate hinge before you had to ask twice, he said. And you don't know what to do with that. A long pause. That's right, she said. He nodded. He looked at the fire. I can't solve that for you. I'm the wrong person to tell you which part of it to weigh heavier. I can only tell you... He stopped and started again because he wanted to be careful with this. I can tell you that everything I read in those letters convinced me that you were exactly who you said you were in that first letter. That you were honest when honesty was uncomfortable. That you were braver than you gave yourself credit for being. That you were someone worth knowing properly, worth doing this correctly for. He looked at her. And I didn't do it correctly, he said. I did it wrong from the beginning, and I kept doing it wrong because I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you would decide the whole thing was built on a lie and leave. And I didn't want you to leave. He held her gaze. That's all of it, Eleanor. That's the complete truth. I don't have anything else underneath it. The east light was fully in the room now. She sat in the chair with her coffee held in both hands and her dark eyes on his face, and she was doing the thing she always did, reading carefully, going back to check the earlier pages against the later ones. You said in your letter, she said slowly, the first one you sent me, you said you found my honesty refreshing. Yes. And then you built the whole thing on a deception. Yes. That must have been uncomfortable, she said, and the precision of it was almost dry, almost the tone she used when she was making a pointed observation about fence posts or soil drainage, and it was close enough to the old Eleanor, the one who made him almost smile across the fire, that something in him moved toward it despite everything. It was, he said. Yes. She set her cup down on the arm of the chair and looked at the window. The light was good now, the kind of March morning that almost lied to you about spring being close. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it the same way you just answered everything else. All right. In the letters, she said, the ones you read, when you read what I wrote about you, about the things I was... She paused, picking her words. About the things I was starting to understand about this place, and about you. When you read those things, what did you do with them? He looked at her for a moment. I kept them, he said. In what sense? I remembered them, he said. I thought about them. When you wrote that the silence from me wasn't the same as indifference, that it took you a while to learn the difference, I thought about that for days. When you wrote that the hailstorm was the most normal you'd felt since arriving, when you wrote that, when you imagined leaving, what you felt wasn't relief. He stopped. I held those things, because they were, He stopped again, because they mattered. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright in the morning light, and not from tears, he thought, or not only from that, from something more complicated that he did not have a word for and was not sure she did either. You fell in love with me through my letters, she said. He didn't answer immediately. He held the statement for a moment and looked at it honestly. I think so, he said. Yes. Without my knowledge. Yes. While I was falling... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the window and then back at him. While I was trying to figure out if I was even wanted here, whether I was more than an arrangement, he held her gaze. You were never just an arrangement, not to me, not after the first letter. But you let me think I might be, she said, for months. You let me sit in the uncertainty of it because it felt safer than the truth. Yes, he said, that was wrong. It was wrong, she said. It was... She exhaled. It was deeply unkind, Silas. Not the reading of the letters, or not only that, the letting me wonder, the letting me write to Clara that I was waiting for someone to say something real while you sat across the fire knowing every real thing I had and saying nothing. I know, he said. I want you to know that I know what that cost me, she said. I want you to understand that specifically. I'm not saying it to punish you. I'm saying it because if we're being honest now, that's part of the honest. I understand, he said. I do. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire needed attention, and he got up and added wood, and he came back and sat on the edge of the bedroll, and they were closer now, not by much, and the morning was fully in the room. My father used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when things are easy, she said eventually. It's what they do when they've made a mess. She looked at him. He was a man with a lot of opinions, and most of them weren't worth much. But that one might have been right. He waited. You could have kept lying, she said. When my mother mentioned your letter, you could have said you'd had someone else write it for you. Something. You didn't. No, he said. You could have given me half the truth, an easier version of it. She tilted her head slightly. You gave me the whole thing. You asked for the whole thing, he said. People ask for the whole thing all the time, she said. They don't always get it. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The morning light made the cabin look different than it looked in any other kind of light. More worn, more real, the cracks in the plaster visible, and the unevenness of the floorboards showing, and the shelves along the back wall with their 80 books standing exactly as they always had. She stood up. He watched her cross the room to the back shelves. She moved along them slowly, the way she had on that first day, her eyes moving over the spines. She stopped at the Thoreau. She took it down. She turned it in her hands and opened it to the place where the spine was most broken, the pages worn soft at the edges, and she read whatever was there, and he didn't ask what it was. She closed the book. She turned and she walked back toward him, and she held the book out, and he looked at it, and then at her face, and her face was doing several things at once that he could not fully read, which was unusual, and he found he didn't need to read all of them. "I want you to read to me," she said, "out loud, right now. Your voice, not mine." He looked at her. "I've spent a year in this cabin," she said, "and I have never once heard you read. I have heard you work, and I have heard you think, and I have heard you say useful things about fence posts and weather and land law." The corners of her mouth moved, not quite the smile, the thing before the smile. "I want to hear you read, and then we are going to figure out the rest." He took the book. He looked down at the page where it fell open, and he recognized the passage. He had read it enough times to know it without looking, but he looked anyway because it deserved to be looked at. He read. His voice was not a reading voice in the performed sense. It was the same voice he used for everything else, low and unadorned, moving at its own pace, not trying to be something other than what it was. He read 3 paragraphs, and he was aware of her sitting across from him in the chair she had pulled close, listening with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, the complete kind, the kind that felt like being taken seriously. He stopped at the end of the 3rd paragraph. "Keep going," she said. He kept going. Outside, the March morning was doing what March mornings eventually do on Blackridge. The light fully arrived now, honest and clear, showing everything exactly as it was, no more and no less. The snow and the mud and the mountains and the long, difficult country that didn't care what you deserved but rewarded, sometimes, the people who stayed. He read to her for almost an hour. Not continuously. They stopped twice, once when the fire needed wood again, and once when she asked him a question about a particular passage, the one about the mass of men leading lives of quiet desperation, whether he believed it was true. He said he thought it was true for some people and not others, and that the difference was usually whether the person had chosen their life or merely ended up in it. She considered that for a moment and then said she thought the choosing was harder than it sounded, because most people didn't realize they had a choice until they were already deep into someone else's idea of what their life should look like. "Is that why you left Ohio?" he asked. "Partly," she said. "Is that why you came here?" "Yes," he said. She nodded, as if that settled something, and told him to keep reading. He read until the light had fully established itself in the room, and the morning was no longer early, and they had both had a second cup of coffee, and the fire had settled into its midday rhythm, steady and low and sufficient. When he finally closed the book, she did not immediately speak, and he did not push into the silence. He had learned, over a year, that her silences were working silences. They meant something was being decided, and the decision was better if left alone to complete itself. "We have things to work out," she said finally. "Yes." "Not small things." "No," he agreed. "Not small." She looked at him with the directness that had not changed since the stage platform in Ridgeline, that first moment of contact, the quick dark eyes taking inventory. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine, what you did with the letters. I'm not there yet, and I may not get there quickly." "I'm not asking you to." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm telling you anyway because I think we've had enough of things going unsaid." He accepted that without comment, because she was right, and because he recognized, in the particular way she had phrased it, an opening rather than a door closing. "I'm not there yet" was not the same as "I will not get there." He knew her well enough by now to understand the difference, and he understood, too, the specific irony of knowing her that well under these particular circumstances. "There's something else," he said. She looked at him. "The letters," he said. "All of them. The ones you sent home over the past year." He paused. "I kept copies." She went still. "What do you mean you kept copies?" Before I resealed them, he said. I copied some of them. The ones I... He stopped, chose the word carefully. The ones I read more than once. The silence that followed was different from her working silences. It was the kind that has an edge. You copied my private letters, she said. Yes. To keep? Yes. She stood up. Not in anger exactly. She was too controlled for that, or the anger was too large for a simple standing up to contain it. But the movement was involuntary, the body needing to do something while the mind caught up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, and he waited. Where are they? She said. Cedar chest, under the floor in the corner. A pause. You have a box under the floor. For important documents. She turned around and looked at him with an expression that contained, he thought, approximately 7 different things simultaneously, and he could identify most of them and preferred not to rank them. You put my letters in a box with your important documents, she said. He held her gaze. Yes. She stood at the window for a long moment. Then she crossed the room to the corner he had indicated, and he got up and moved the braided rug and lifted the loose floorboard and pulled out the cedar chest. Not large, the size of a document box, the cedar still giving off its faint, dry smell. And he set it on the table and stepped back. She opened it. Inside, the land title, folded precisely. The original deed, a survey map, a letter from his father, very old, the paper soft at the folds, 3 legal documents in a tied bundle, and underneath all of it, a small stack of papers, not folded, lying flat, her handwriting on every one. She lifted them out and held them without reading them, just the weight of them in her hands, looking at him. How many? She said. 14. She looked at the stack. He watched her count, or estimate the count, and he watched her put the number against the months and understand the selection it implied, that he had not copied every letter, only the ones that had mattered enough to want to hold on to, and that the selecting was its own kind of statement. She set them back in the chest. She did not read them. I want you to understand, she said quietly, that these belong to me. They do, he said. I'll decide what happens to them. That's right, he said. She closed the chest. She stood with her hand on the lid for a moment, and he stayed where he was, at the distance he had maintained since she crossed the room, not moving toward her, letting her have the space the moment required. She did not move away from the chest. My mother's going to ask questions, she said, after a while. Her voice had changed slightly. The specific shift of someone moving from one register to another, from the confrontation into something more complicated. When I write back, after all of this, she'll ask whether things are all right. What will you tell her? He asked. I don't know yet. She looked at him. What would you tell her? He thought about it. That we're working it out. That we're both still here. That's honest, she said. I'm trying to be. She almost smiled, just barely. The near smile, the one he had catalogued over 12 months of mornings. The small pull at the corner of her mouth that she didn't quite commit to. It appeared and disappeared quickly, but he'd seen it, and the seeing of it did what it always did. You're going to have to be honest with me about everything now, she said. Not some things. Everything. I need to know that the version of you I'm dealing with is the complete one. Agreed, he said. Including when you disagree with me. You've been very, she paused, considering. Very measured this whole year. I think some of that was you being careful because of the lie. I don't want careful. I want honest, even when honest is inconvenient. I can do that, he said. You'll have to prove it over time, she said. I'm not accepting it on faith. I wouldn't expect you to, he said. Faith isn't the same as evidence. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. It isn't. The day moved forward in the way that days do after significant things happen in the morning. Not slowly, exactly, but with a kind of altered weight, each ordinary task carrying more awareness than usual. Eleanor made the midday meal while he repaired a section of harness he'd been putting off. They ate at the table across from each other, and the meal was not silent, but the words were ordinary ones, about the south fence and the planting schedule for April, and whether the mud would be workable by the end of the month. The ordinary words, said honestly, in a room where the cedar chest sat on the table and the Thoreau was beside it, and outside the March light was doing its best work. After he cleared the dishes, he said, I should show you something. She looked up from the account book she had pulled out. The books, he said. The ones I told you belong to the previous owners. She set the pen down. He went to the shelf, and he took them down one at a time. Not all 80, but the ones that had particular histories. And he told her. The Thoreau, purchased in Carthen for 75 cents from a man clearing out an estate because he had heard of it and was curious. The Shakespeare, ordered by post from a bookseller in Denver 2 years later, when the winters had gotten long enough that he felt the lack of something with real density to it. The law volumes, bought deliberately and read systematically over the course of a winter when the boundary dispute with Greer first began. The surveyor's manual, which he had used and which showed it. The novel with the broken spine he was slightly embarrassed about, a thing he had read 3 times because it was about a man who had made a serious mistake and spent the rest of the book trying to understand whether he was still the same person who had made it. She listened to all of it. When he got to the novel, she looked at it for a moment and then at him. "Did you figure out the answer?" she said. "To the question the book asks." "I think the book's answer is yes," he said. "I'm not sure I agreed with it." "What's your answer?" He set the book down on the shelf and looked at it. "I think you're the same person who made the mistake," he said. "I think that's the point. You don't get to be a different person just because you'd prefer to be. You have to be the same person and make different choices." She was quiet for a moment. "That's harder than the book's answer." "Yes," he said, "but more honest." "I think so." She nodded once, the way she nodded when something had been resolved to her satisfaction. Not agreed with necessarily, but fully examined and placed. She picked up the surveyor's manual and turned it over in her hands, looking at the cover. "I want to learn to read these," she said. "The survey maps. If the boundary disputes are going to keep happening, I should understand what I'm reading." He looked at her. "I can show you." "Good," she said, and set the manual on the table beside the account book. "We can start this week." That was how they began again. Not with a declaration or a scene, but with a surveyor's manual on the table and a practical plan for Tuesday, and 2 people who had decided, without making a ceremony of it, that the working forward was the thing. It was not a smooth transition. He had not expected it to be, and she had not promised it would be. There were days in the weeks that followed when the distance came back. Not the careful mutual distance of the first months, which had been the distance of strangers being polite, but a sharper thing. The distance of someone who had been hurt and had not finished processing it. He recognized the difference and did not try to close it artificially. He showed up. He fixed things. He said what he meant when she asked him questions and offered what he thought when she didn't. She told him in April, after a week in which he had been quieter than usual, and he had not pushed on it, that she was going to write to Clara and tell her everything. "Everything," he said. "The whole story, from the beginning." She looked at him steadily. "Clara will be angry with you." "That seems fair." She might write back with some fairly direct opinions. "Also fair." She paused. "I'm going to tell her that we're staying, that I'm staying." Another pause, shorter. "If that's still—" "Yes," he said, before she could finish. "That's still." She nodded and went back to her letter. He went back to the harness he was working on, and the afternoon did what spring afternoons did on the ridge, the light going long and gold through the west window, and the creek was fully audible now for the first time since November, which meant the thaw had reached all the way down. Clara's response arrived 3 weeks later. It was long, and some of it was, as predicted, directed sharply at Silas. Eleanor read it at the table and handed him 2 pages of it with the particular expression of a woman who had decided to be fair, even when fair was slightly uncomfortable. He read it. Clara had opinions. Clara expressed them with the specific, unguarded frankness of a younger sister who had never had to learn the diplomatic restraint her older sibling had spent 23 years developing. She called what he had done a profound invasion, and the kind of thing that erodes trust at the foundations and, frankly, inexcusable. "Eleanor, you are being too reasonable about this." The last one made Eleanor, watching him read, produce the small, near smile and then look away. "She's not wrong," he said, setting the pages down. "No," Eleanor agreed. "She's not." "She loves you," he said. "Aggressively," said Eleanor. He wrote back to Clara himself. He did it without announcing it, and he gave the letter to Eleanor to read before he sealed it, because that was what they did now. Letters were not private weapons or secret intelligence. They were correspondence, and correspondence between two people who trusted each other was available to both. She read his letter to Clara and returned it to him without changes, which was its own kind of verdict. Clara wrote back once more, shorter this time, and did not address him directly, but the tone had shifted from prosecution to something that was possibly provisional acceptance, which was more than he had expected and exactly what he deserved. The spring went forward. The south fence was rebuilt properly. The Greer boundary finally settled into the landscape the way settled things settle. Not with drama, but with the gradual relaxation of something that had been under tension for too long. The kitchen garden went back in. Eleanor planted it larger this year, extending the south bed by 6 feet and adding a row of beans along the east wall that he helped her stake on a Saturday morning while the sky was doing something tentatively beautiful above the ridge. "Your row is crooked," she said. He looked at it. It was slightly crooked. "It's functional," he said. "That's what people say about crooked things when they don't want to fix them." "Do you want me to fix it?" She considered it for a moment with genuine seriousness, tilting her head slightly. "No," she said. "It's fine, but I want it noted." "Noted," he said. She was almost smiling. He was almost smiling. They both looked back at the beans. What happened over the following months was not a transformation. It was something more ordinary and therefore more durable. They became, gradually and through no particular event, a household, a real one, not the careful arrangement they had maintained through the first year, but something with weight and habit and the particular intimacy of two people who have seen each other in difficult moments and remained. He learned to say what he was thinking before she had to ask. She learned, or perhaps permitted herself to act on what she already knew, that the silence from him meant attention, not absence. She moved her things out of the bedroom in June, not as a gesture or not only as one. The bedroll situation had become genuinely impractical as the summer heat built up, and the practicalities of the thing had become a quiet absurdity that neither of them had addressed directly. She said one evening, looking at the general arrangement of the cabin with the same expression she used on inefficient storage systems, "This doesn't make any sense anymore." "No," he agreed. "So." She said it the way she said most practical things, flatly and without adornment. "So," he agreed. It was not a romantic scene. She brought her small stack of belongings from the bedroom with the matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to all relocations of household goods, and he moved the extra chair to make space, and that was mostly that. The intimacy of it was in the ordinariness, which was perhaps how real intimacy always works, not in the large declared moments, but in the adjustments, the making of room. They lay awake talking that first night in a way they had never quite managed before. The particular looseness of late-night conversation when you are horizontal, and the dark makes precision less mandatory. She told him about her first year of teaching, the boy who had been convinced he could not learn to read, and the specific afternoon when something had unlocked for him and she had watched his face change. He told her about the first winter on Blackridge, the one where he had genuinely underestimated what it required, when the cold had been beyond anything he had calibrated himself for, and he had survived it more through stubbornness than preparation. "Were you scared?" she asked. "Very," he said. "You don't seem like someone who gets scared." "I get scared," he said. "I'm just not good at saying so." A pause. "You should get better at that." "I'm working on it," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I was scared when I came here. Not of the mountain, of being wrong. About you, about myself, about whether I was capable of making this work." She paused. "I wrote about it to Clara, but I never said it out loud." "I know," he said, and then stopped, because the instinct was still there, the habit of the letters, the knowing before being told, and he caught it. "You read that one," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I've decided something about that," she said. "About the letters." He waited. "I've decided that you knowing those things about me, the fears and the questions and the rest of it, doesn't diminish me. I thought it would feel that way. Like being read without permission is a kind of losing." She paused. "But I think what I actually lost was the illusion that those things were hidden, and I'm not sure they were very well hidden to begin with." "They weren't," he said. "Not from someone paying attention. Were you always paying attention? From the first letter, he said. She was quiet for a while after that, not the working silence, but the settling kind. And eventually her breathing told him she had fallen asleep, and he lay in the dark, listening to the cabin and the mountain and the creek, which was still running strong. And he thought about all the things that had to go wrong in a specific sequence for this particular thing to have gone right. The Bureau's clerical error, his failure to correct it. Her letter, which had been honest in a way he hadn't known to hope for. His own fear, which had made him choose wrongly, and her anger, which had required him to tell the truth at last. The truth, which had turned out to be survivable. Barely, and not neatly, and with consequences still unfolding, but survivable. He didn't think of that as luck. He thought of it as the accumulated result of two people who were, each in their own flawed and specific way, committed to not disappearing entirely into the easier version of themselves. The cedar chest went back under the floor that fall. Eleanor had taken the letters out and read them herself, alone, one afternoon in August while he was in the far pasture. When he came in, she was at the table with them in a neat stack, and she looked at him when he came through the door. "Some of these are embarrassing," she said. "Which ones?" "The ones where I thought you were emotionally impenetrable and possibly indifferent." "I was doing a reasonable impression of it," he said. "You were doing a very good impression of it," she said. "I want it noted that my misreading was understandable." "Noted," he said. She retied the stack and returned it to the chest. She did not throw them away, which he had half expected and had been prepared to accept without comment either way. She put them back. "These stay," she said. "Not because I've forgiven all of it, because they're part of it. And I think the real things need to be kept, even the ones you're not proud of." He looked at her. "Especially those," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Especially those?" she agreed. The chest went back under the floor, under the rug, under the daily life of the cabin. Above it they cooked and worked and argued about the right way to weatherproof the north wall, and disagreed about the planting schedule for the following spring, and read in the evenings from the 80 books on the back shelf, sometimes aloud and sometimes separately. She read the law volumes and learned to read survey maps with a competence that eventually exceeded his own in the area of boundary notation, which she did not make a performance of, but which he noticed and did not let pass without acknowledgement. "You're better at this than I am now," he said one evening, looking at the surveys she had annotated. "I'm better at the notation," she said. "You're better at the land itself, the knowing where it goes." "We're better together than either of us is separately," he said. She looked up from the survey. Something moved in her expression. Not surprise, not quite, but the recognition of something true being said plainly. "Yes," she said, "we are." The ranch became, over the following years, the kind of operation that people in the valley referenced when they were explaining how a thing should be done. Not large. They never expanded beyond what they could manage with their own hands, and the occasional seasonal help from a young man named Dorsey from Ridgeline, who turned out to be genuinely useful and eventually reliable. But sound. Maintained with the particular attention of two people who understood that the work was not separate from the life, but was the life, and who had no illusions about what that required. There were hard years. A drought in the late summer of the second year that took most of the kitchen garden and required them to recalculate the winter stores with an austerity that was genuinely uncomfortable. A dispute with a new neighbor to the north who turned out to be worse than Greer in his methods, if not in his ambitions, which Eleanor resolved with a letter so precisely documented that the man's lawyer advised him not to pursue it, which Eleanor reported with the same measured satisfaction she had brought to the first Greer victory. An injury, Silas's, the following spring, a badly managed encounter with a piece of frozen equipment that took two of his fingers and put him on limited duty for 6 weeks, during which Eleanor ran the ranch with an efficiency that was, he told her afterward, somewhat alarming. "Alarming," she repeated. "Competent," he said. "Very competent." "That's what I thought you meant," she said, and brought him his coffee. They were not a perfect household. They were impatient with each other sometimes. She with his tendency to wait too long to say difficult things. He with her tendency to handle her fears privately until they had grown too large to manage alone. They learned each other's patterns of retreat and developed imperfectly and through practice, ways of reaching past them. Some days it worked better than others. That was the truth of it, and the truth was what they had agreed on. They were also, on the best days, and many of the ordinary ones, Exactly what two people can be when they have decided to stop protecting themselves from each other and start building something instead. Years later, when this valley had grown and the road to Ridgeline had been improved and the nearest town was no longer quite as isolated as it had been, there were people who had known the Rowans since the early days and who would tell newer arrivals that the ranch on the North Ridge was a good operation, well run, fair dealing, the kind of place where a handshake meant something and the word of the people in it could be relied on. They usually said this as a simple observation, the way you describe a geographical fact, because to those who had been in the valley long enough, it had simply become true and didn't require explanation. What they didn't know, because it was not their story to know, was that under the floor of the cabin, in a cedar chest between a land title and a surveyor's manual, there was a stack of 14 letters in a woman's handwriting, tied with a piece of practical string that had been written in the privacy of the first year and read by the wrong person and kept by him and eventually reclaimed by her and placed back where he had kept them, not as a monument to the mistake or to the survival of it, but as evidence. The kind you keep not to prove anything to anyone else, but to remember, in the years when things are working smoothly, what it costs to get there. Outside the cabin, season after season, the mountain did what mountains do. Outlasted everything, indifferent and enormous, and in certain lights, at certain hours, extraordinarily beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they make no effort to be anything other than exactly what they are. Inside, Silas Rowan read to his wife by firelight, and Eleanor Rowan ran her hand along the familiar broken spine of the Thoreau, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was not the same as silence anymore. It hadn't been for a long time.